so much, Nasreen. I should have said in my introduction as well that I'm blind, and so I'm very grateful to Nasreen for operating the slides. Thank you, Nasreen. And when they stop, please do tell me if the video isn't focused on me squarely. I have permanent problems with working out where the video is pointing and what it's showing. Okay, so I'm going to talk about human rights, the international human rights context for a lot of the work going on in MuseIT. I think some of you might know some of what I'm going to say, so apologies for that. But I know it might be less familiar to some of you as well. So I'm going to keep it fairly high level and easy access, hopefully. But please do ask any questions afterwards if anything isn't clear. So if we could go to slide 3, please, Nasreen.
So, overview.
Yes, so just how I'm going to divide up the talk. First, I'm just going to say a little bit about the background of the main relevant human rights treaty, which is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And then look a little bit more at some of the specific rights in that treaty, which are relevant to design and technology, and also to culture. And then finally, just have a few reflections, which hopefully you'll join in on at the end, on why this might be relevant to people working on design and technology in the cultural space, but more generally as well. So moving on to the next slide, please.
Background.
Yeah, that's just a heading. And so the next one.
So origins of UN.
Thank you, Nasreen. Yeah. So there's a picture, hopefully, that you can see on the screen.
Yes.
So this is, I don't know whether it has a name there. Some of you might recognize who it is. It's Eleanor Roosevelt. And if we could go to the next slide as well, please.
Yes.
So this is her husband, who is Franklin Roosevelt, who was President of the United States during the Second World War and in the years after the Second World War. This is relevant for a number of reasons to the origins of the United Nations human rights system, because it was out of the Second World War and the horrors of realizing the abuse that governments could inflict on their own citizens that the international human rights system was born. Franklin Roosevelt was himself a disabled person. I think this is one of the rare pictures of him in his wheelchair. It was regarded as a sign of weakness to be disabled at that time, so it's very rare that there are any images of him using a wheelchair. His wife, Eleanor, was very active in the development and supporting the negotiations around the early human rights treaties. There was a declaration in 1948, which is the root of the international human rights system. That was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it was at that time that the picture of her that was just shown was taken. So she, and I think it's really useful, she has a very famous quote that she gave 10 years later to mark the 10-year anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, known as the small places, which I'm sure many of you will have heard. But I think it's one of those passages that I think bears countless repetitions. So I don't apologize for saying it again, for reading it out again. And I think part of what is important about this passage is it stresses what's important about human rights. And it's easy to think that they're just something remote, they're international, so therefore remote, they're a long way from us and the concerns of our daily lives. But that was never how human rights were intended to operate, and never the idea of the difference that they were supposed to make. So this is her words then. Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home. So close and so small that they cannot be seen on any map of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person. The neighbourhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. And I think it's really useful to bear that in mind, especially when we've got, big international research projects, because that's really the ambition of all of us, to make a difference in the places, small places, that make a difference to the lives of individuals. Slide 7, please, Nadreen.
Yes. So
now we come to the convention that's relevant to disability, most relevant to disability, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is a mouthful. So I'm going to refer to that now as the CRPD, or the convention. And this was only drafted in 2008, which is obviously, sorry, only came into force in 2008. It was actually agreed and adopted in 2006. But that's 60 years after the beginnings of the United Nations human rights system. So it's I think its drafting only makes sense if we think of it a little bit in light of some of what went before. So the backdrop of former human rights treaties, there were quite a few former there are quite a few human rights treaties which were adopted and came into force well before the CRPD. And these were supposed to be universal in the sense of being relevant to everybody, applying to everybody, all human beings, in countries that have ratified or become parties to those treaties. So most famously, and probably most importantly, in 1966, there were two big international human rights treaties adopted: the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And then after that, there were a number of more specific treaties, really recognizing the fact that, although they were intended to be universal, more information, more specific provisions were needed on particular issues. So some of them were issue-based, like the convention relating to torture and migrant workers, another one on migrant workers, and others were more group-based. So the first of those was on race and ethnicity, and then there was one on gender, and then there was one on children. And they went to the one on children, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, was 1990. And there was a long gap between that and then the CRPD, which was only drafted, its drafting finished in 2006. It was really drafted between 2002 and 2006. So it was a long gap. It was late on the scene. the purpose of it, well, we'll come to the purpose in the next slide. I won't go into that. So when this treaty started to be drafted, when the General Assembly of the United Nations gave permission and requested it to be drafted, the process was a little slow to start with. And this was because they used the normal drafting procedures at the United Nations, but it was quite quickly realized that they wouldn't work in connection with disability because there wasn't enough understanding of the problems that disabled people experienced, the nature of exclusion that disabled people experienced all over the world. And so the drafting rules were changed so that there could be a working group, an ad hoc committee set up, which would have space for disabled people from around the world to get very actively involved in informing the drafting process. And I was lucky enough to be part of that towards the end. And it was just fascinating and very exciting to be there. And we'll come back to the importance of the involvement of disabled people in that process later on when we look at the terms of the treaty. Slide 8, please, Nasreen.
Yes.
So the purpose of this treaty, I've got on the screen there, it was about equal enjoyment of human rights. So it wasn't to create new rights for disabled people. It was to try and ensure that the rights that were supposed to be available for everybody, which was supposed to be universal, were actually meaningfully enjoyed by disabled people. That disabled people had a chance to enjoy these human rights alongside other people, that there wasn't a disability exclusion dimension built into the human rights system and the way it was operating in different countries. And that was, the need for that was recognised because of various United Nations reports which showed that there was a huge level of disability-related disadvantage experienced by people around the world, and that there was a problem in the human rights system where disability issues were going neglected and ignored. So the ways that having a new treaty that was specifically on disability was intended to make a difference was by increasing the visibility of disability as a human rights issue. And by enhancing clarity, by giving more clarity about what governments should do to, if they were serious about implementing human rights for disabled people as well as for everybody else. So having a treaty like this one, the CRPD, which goes into a little bit more detail about what governments need to do, for instance, to ensure that the right to be free from torture is equally available to disabled people, or the right to education is equally available to disabled people. And third, enhanced engagement. So the CRPD creates its own monitoring mechanisms. It has a UN committee that oversees how it's being implemented in the countries that have ratified it. And there are opportunities for people to make complaints to that committee if they think their government hasn't implemented their rights appropriately. But there are also mechanisms for shadow reports. So whenever a government's record is being examined, the committee will also look at what's known as shadow reports, which are submitted by civil society organisations, which give an idea of, another perspective on how well the government in that country is doing and where there might be gaps and problems. And that's the engagement at the international level. But obviously there are also, it creates another way of engaging with governments at the national level and down at the local government level. So coming back to the small places that Eleanor Roosevelt mentioned. Slide 9, please, Nasreen.
Yes.
So moving on now to the second main section, which is the scope of the CRPD rights. Oh, sorry, no, this is still part of the first section. Scope of the CRPD rights. So it covers all human rights that were previously set out in other human rights treaties. So it covers civil and political rights, like the right to life, the right to be free from torture, the right to freedom of expression, the right to vote. It also covers economic, social, and cultural rights. And these include things like the right to education, the right to the highest attainable standard of health, the right to work and employment, and cultural rights. And those are particularly important for this project. So I want to highlight here Article 30 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. And this is called participation in cultural life, recreation, leisure and sport. And just to read you a couple of things from this article. It says states parties, so these are ones who have signed up to this treaty. States parties recognise the right of persons with disabilities to take part on an equal basis with others in cultural life, and shall take all appropriate measures to ensure that persons with disabilities A, enjoy access to cultural materials in accessible formats, B, enjoy access to television programmes, films, theatre and other cultural activities in accessible formats, C, enjoy access to places for cultural performances or services, such as theatres, museums, cinemas, libraries and tourism services, and as far as possible, enjoy access to monuments and sites of national cultural importance. So that's a really helpful article for anyone working in that sort of space. I should mention here that the CRPD does also, it doesn't just repeat what's in previous treaties about these rights, it re-articulates them in ways that are particularly relevant to disabled people. And because of that, there's been a long debate about whether it actually went beyond what its original purpose was and did end up creating new rights. And we'll come on to what some of those might be in a minute. So next slide, please, slide 10.
Yes.
And these next two sections are a bit quicker, you'll be relieved to hear. Rights which are particularly relevant to design and technology in the CRPD. Slide 11.
Yes.
Sorry, this sounds really boring and legalistic, this slide. It's just a list of articles, but I wanted you to have these so you can look them up. They are, you know, there's lots of information about all of these on the web if you want to follow them up. Just to introduce them, Article 4, Paragraph 1, and we're going to come back to another paragraph in Article 4 later on. Article 4 is called general obligations. So, you know, it's one of the key cross-cutting articles in the CRPD. It's right there up at the front of the CRPD. Paragraphs F and G are particularly relevant to universal design and the creation of new technologies. Article 4.1F requires states parties, countries that have ratified this treaty, to undertake or promote research and development of universally designed goods, services, equipment, and facilities to meet the specific needs of persons with disabilities and to promote their availability and use. So that's very relevant. And then paragraph G requires those states parties to, again, undertake or promote research and development and promote the availability and use of new technologies, including communication technologies, mobility aids and assistive devices. And it also says that they should give priority to technologies at an affordable cost. So then Article 9, which is called accessibility, that's one of the articles that there's been some debate about whether this is a new right, because there's never been anything called a right to accessibility in previous treaties. But the argument is that it was just assumed, it was never needed to be articulated when disability wasn't the specific focus, because you know, it was assumed that people would have access to roads, services, communications, but accessibility is a big barrier for disabled people, so it needs to be highlighted as a specific article in the treaty. So Article 9 is quite wide in scope. It covers accessibility of physical environment, transport, and also information, communication and technologies. It's quite a long article, which you can read at your leisure if you want to. It does also make it clear that, you know, as well as applying to publicly run services and facilities, it also applies to, so it imposes an obligation on governments to make sure that facilities and services that are run by private bodies but are open to the public, that they're accessible as well. So governments have obligations to introduce laws, regulations, guidelines, standards to ensure that the services and facilities run by private actors are accessible if they're open to the public. Article 5 is really relevant as well. This is on equality and non-discrimination, and you know, to avoid discrimination, accessibility is really important. So often failures to provide accessibility will amount to discrimination, and Article 5 requires states to introduce laws that make discrimination unlawful and suitably punishable. And then Article 4 again, so we come back to Article 4 here, but this is paragraph 3, and I wanted to highlight this separately. This one and the next article I'm going to mention are slightly different from the other articles because they're a little bit more about process rather than substance. So Article 4.3 is probably the most important paragraph in the treaty. It requires states parties to ensure that in the implementation of all articles of this treaty, all the ones we've looked at, disabled people and their organisations are closely consulted and actively involved. And although that obligation is on states parties, I think that brings us back to the whole process of the drafting of the treaty, the importance of the involvement of disabled people. And it's something that, you know, you in MuseIT, other researchers, other designers, we can all take on board. You know, it highlights the importance at an international level of this principle of involvement of disabled people in things that affect them. And then Article 32, finally, this is called international cooperation. And it requires states parties, it requires governments to facilitate cooperation in research, so in various things to do with the treaty, but one of them, which I'll highlight, is in paragraph C, which is facilitating cooperation in research and access to scientific and technical knowledge. And there are various other relevant provisions in there, but that's probably the most important one. So, you know, international cooperation is something that the treaty really recognises the importance of, particularly with countries which are less, you know, in the global south maybe, who are less resourced in terms of technical expertise or economic resource to fund it. So slide 12, please, Nazreen.
Yes.
So bringing us on to the end section, why the CRPD matters to researchers and designers. So why are we starting off this 2 days with a session on human rights? Why does the CRPD matter to projects like MuseIT and the work that it's cultivating and fostering? And in some ways, this is a question for you to reflect on, but I've done a bit of reflecting as well. And slide 13, please, Nazreen.
Yes.
I think to contextualize that question, you know, you might start off from a devil's advocate position and say, well, it doesn't really matter because it's not technically relevant. The treaty is one that is only binding on governments that have ratified this treaty. It's them that are bound by the treaty. The treaty doesn't actually require other people to do anything. They might, and yeah, anyway, I'll come back to possible answers in a minute. I want to also say that I think your funding comes from the EU, so the treaty does also apply to regional integration organisations that have ratified the treaty, and the European Union is a regional integration organisation that has ratified this treaty, so it is also binding on the EU. And the EU is, you know, it's had a massive influence on various aspects of the EU already. So it's very much at the heart of the EU's disability strategy, for instance. So that's the devil's advocate position. It only binds them. It doesn't bind us as researchers or designers or operators. But some thoughts that do make it relevant. It embodies, and the most obvious one of these is that it embodies, it states, it sets out the normative standards, the values, the principles, and the commitments to which governments around the world have signed up. It's been very widely ratified, this treaty. So it represents the international aims around disability inclusion. And I think linked to that, it embodies and going back to the involvement issue, it embodies the standards and approaches, the rights for which disabled people around the world have come together and fought. It's been called a manifesto in a sense because of the degree of involvement. It was an unprecedented degree of involvement by the people for whom a human rights treaty is intended to benefit. So it really is very much influenced by disabled people's organisations around the world. And that's relevant, I think, to projects which are committed to inclusion. So slide 14.
Yes.
It also has relevance potentially to methodology and the way proposals are shaped and operated. So Article 4.3, the one about active involvement and close consultation. We come back to that one. And I think that also that goes for research, that goes for design processes. It also is relevant to dissemination and impact. It creates channels for dissemination and impact of research and design outputs. So, we know that governments are going to be interested in technologies which enhance the possibilities for inclusion, especially if they're affordable. And it creates opportunities through things like the coming together of the governments when they get together. There's an annual conference of state parties to do with the CRPD, and there's opportunities for side events there, which create, a really good global audience for interested in things around disability and inclusion, which if you're sponsored by a disabled people's organisation, you might be able to present findings. And there might be other ways it's relevant as well. I've left that with a question mark for you. Okay, I hope I haven't gone over time.